this underrated 90s anime action movie is more relevant than ever. The 1980s and 1990s were an era of beautiful and breathtaking anime films and OVAs. These works were both original stories and adaptations of more esoteric manga, the latter of which might not have had the same mainstream anime appeal as works such as Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball. Nevertheless, their movie iterations were many times classics in their own right, and one such example was Jin-Roh, The Wolf Brigade. Adapting the first volume of the screenwriter's manga series, Jin-Roh was a many times brutal political story that dealt with themes of authoritarianism. Beginning with a riot/protest scene and being based in a world where World War II went much differently, it's a film that's as relevant nowadays as it was when it was initially released in 1999. Though only faintly praised for these elements when it came out, these themes make Jin-Roh into a timeless classic, even more so than more well-known cyberpunk anime with similar themes. What is the anime film Jin-Roh about? Jin-Roh, The Wolf Brigade was directed by Hiroyuki Okura, who was also involved with such prolific franchises as Cowboy Bebop and the cyberpunk classic Ghost in the Shell. More recently, he worked on the rebuild of Evangelion movie series, an anime entry in the Blade Runner franchise and the smash hit mecha anime series Mobile Suit Gundam, The Witch from Mercury. It was also written by Mamoru Oshii, with the film acting as an adaptation of his manga series, Kerberos Panzerkopf. It's actually the third adaptation of the material, though it's the only one to be fully animated, with the others being live-action projects. The setting of the world is an alternate take on real history, with Japan having been a member of the Allies in World War II before being occupied by Germany. It was eventually freed from German rule, though the new Japanese government has its own issues. This causes the uprising of a terrorist group known as the Sect, sending society into further turmoil. Adding fuel to the fire is the response to these terrorist threats, the armored squadron known as Kerberos. Beginning with a deadly riot scene, the movie focuses on Kerberos member Kazuki Fuse, who follows Nanami, a member of the Sect, into the sewers. He's awestruck when she chooses to sacrifice herself via an explosive satchel, and he later becomes enthralled by her sister Kei. The two fall in love, despite Kei's actually being a part of a group that seeks to undermine the Kerberos. Their loyalties end up being tested, however, especially after they encounter the group known as Jin-Roh. This leads them both down a violent and tragic path, showcasing the horrors of an unconventional war and a society turned upside down. Jin-Roh showcases the loss of humanity in war. Though the societal conflict seen in Jin-Roh, The Wolf Brigade isn't a true war, it does stem from the fallout of the movie's alternate take on World War II. Likewise, with the constant riots and protests, the streets of this alternate 1950s Japan are very much a war zone at times. The idea of a post-World War II Japan experiencing a much different history was also explored in the police mecha anime series Pat Labor, namely Pat Labor 2, which was directed by Mamoru Oshii. Thus, the movie's central theme is how war can rob people of their humanity in different ways. One example is Fuse, who's initially just one of several good soldiers. His issues begin when he starts to question his place in the world and his own morality. Ironically, it's in the midst of conflict that he and Kei fall in love, yet their ideological differences and their function within certain groups ultimately separates them. By the end of the film, Fuse is a shell of a man who can't believe the actions he's taken. The ongoing conflict that he's been forced into has robbed him of any true humanity, despite his attempts to maintain these traits. Even Nanami can be seen as an example of a character who's lost her humanity. She's essentially a plot device in the film and only exists to kill herself in the name of her ideology. A young woman who's seemingly around the same age as Fuse or younger, almost the entirety of her life has involved the veritable war that Japan has been involved in. For both sides of the argument, she's merely a statistic in their many battles. In fact, she's only humanized posthumously by her sister Kei, noting how their mother seemed to always prefer Nanami because she was the youngest of the siblings. This showcases how she was an actual young lady with a life, family and likely hopes and dreams beyond any ideological ties. Bits and pieces of civilian life are shown in Jin-Roh, The Wolf Brigade, but there's a certain blandness to these almost slice-of-life moments in the story. Fuse isn't shown to have much in the way of outside interests or hobbies, with his reading the story of Little Red Riding Hood, which becomes a symbolic part of the plot, being an exception. This is more of a thematic Chekhov's gun than anything, and it once again plays into how the ongoing authoritarian occupation has rendered so much of life inert. Even before people die, they're stuck in a sort of proverbial limbo that keeps them from truly living. The lack of an obvious true path also showcases the story's biggest strength, and how it can be applied to similar issues in the modern era. Jin-Roh's politics are topical and universal. At the most obvious level, Jin-Roh, the Wolf Brigade, is an indictment of fascism and authoritarianism. Japan is portrayed as switching from one domineering government to another, with the denazification of the country post-World War II only giving rise to another government with immense problems. Likewise, the sect is blatantly portrayed as an extremist and leftist terrorist organization that mainly manifests through violence and even suicide bombings. It's no less of a might-makes-right group than the Kerberos and the government. It also only seems to offer eventual and meaningless death as its endgame, with both Nanami and Kei suffering this fate without making any sort of true difference. In this way, Jin-Roh, the Wolf Brigade, succeeds thematically by not automatically making one side good or evil. In fact, its central theme is to not take a side at all in an ideological and physical war. Jin-Roh boils down to the idea that, in any group, the choices and whims of the group will always prevail over the individual. This has just as much, if not more, propensity to be disastrous than good, with both good guys and bad guys operating off of groupthink. The true fascism isn't inherent in any particular ideology, but rather in any group that eschews individuality for the sake of a so-called common good. The person who stands out will also fall victim to the crowd of wolves, be it their opposing team or their own allegiances. As mentioned, things don't go well for members on either side of the conflict, with those attempting to go against some grain being the ones to suffer the most. If anything, the ones who are shown with the most normal lives are the everyday non-military or terrorist civilians. Even then, their lives are inevitably intertwined with the political ramifications surrounding them. These concepts can very much be applied to countless conflicts and political uprisings around the world, especially in today's world. Wars, rumors of war, and differing views on the absence or presence of fascism and authoritarianism are the prevailing thoughts of the day, and such paragraphs are likely written on the pages of every generation. For this reason, Jin-Roh, the Wolf Brigade, is especially relevant for today's society, though in ways that most might not expect. In the end, it's a message to remain individual and think while thinking freely is still free, regardless of how easy it is to be swayed by countless thoughts, movements, groups, and persuasions. It succeeds at this tone and scope far better than more well-known classics such as Ghost in the Shell or even the acclaimed anime film Akira. The movie is also an absolute classic of political intrigue, espionage, and action, especially for fans of anime and manga works from that era. While it might have been released at the turn of the century, it's certainly no less relevant in today's world.